Welcome again to the Wolves and Moose of Isle Royale. For this lecture, we're going to shift gears pretty substantially. We're going to talk about the life history of moose. And to understand what we even mean by this life history of moose, we can remind ourselves, I showed a slide several lectures ago describing how the organization of life has different hierarchical levels. We spent quite a bit of time thinking about wolves and moose of Isle Royale as populations. And we talked about population dynamics and that sort of thing. Now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this level of the organism. And basically what I want you to appreciate is that there's an entire field of inquiry that's referred to as life history theory. And that's why the title of this lecture is about the life history of moose. And life history theory is all focused on this idea of the organism being the object of central interest. Not populations, not communities or ecosystems, but the organism itself. And the basic premise of life history theory can be expressed and be appreciated by thinking about this very simple graph. And on this graph what we have is a histogram showing that moose, these happen to be moose from Sweden, they're all the same age, 2.5 years old, and shows how it is that they don't all have the same body size. And in fact, just appreciate, some of the smallest moose on this graph are only about half as big, approximately, as some of the biggest moose on this graph. And so the question is why? Why is body size, to just take one trait of all of the traits that an organism could have, just thinking about body size here, why is it so variable? Because, and again, to be clear, we could ask this kind of question about all kinds of traits that an organism has. How long does it live? How tall is it? The color of it. For humans, we could speak about the color of hair, all this sort of thing. Anything you could measure on an organism, it's usually a variable trait. Different organisms have different values for whatever that thing is that you're measuring. Now, we know some of the answers or have a rough idea about what explains all this variation. Well, we can say, well, maybe genetic diversity is an important part of it. These organisms don't all have the same genes. And some genes must code for organisms that end up being larger and others smaller. Okay, that's fine. Environmental variation, we know that that might play a role. Maybe some of these organisms are in different habitats, and some habitats they lend themselves to the organisms being bigger, and maybe other habitats for smaller. Okay, that's fine. But that's not quite enough. We need to do a better job of answering this question, what explains the variation, than simply saying, oh, well, some of it's due to genetic diversity and some of it's due to environmental variation. To appreciate how we can do a better job, we can just ask ourselves a few more questions. And so some of these questions can be, are the bigger moose the most fit moose? Is bigger better? Okay, maybe the answer is yes, or maybe the answer is no. It's not obvious. But if the answer is yes, well, then why are those small moose still around? Wouldn't natural selection, wouldn't the old survival of the fittest idea have eliminated those smaller moose basically from the gene pool? The most common size is intermediate. The most common size are these moose right here, okay, in the middle. Is that the best size to be? Are those the most fit moose? And then the other moose that are a little bigger, they're like too big for their own good. And the moose that are too small, they're too small for their own good. To be in the middle is somewhere that's the best. Or there's an alternative, and maybe each one of these moose is equally successful. Maybe body size involves trade-offs. Maybe being big is good in some ways, but it also has some drawbacks. And maybe being small is good in some different ways, but it has different drawbacks. And what happens is that these are just different ways of being. You could be small or intermediate-sized or big. They're just different ways of being. Overall, they're equally fit modes of existence, if you will. That's what life history theory is largely about, is about answering these more detailed questions that are kind of represented by this graph. And again, I wanted to emphasize, or I would like to emphasize, that this question could be asked of almost any trait. Here we're focusing on body size of moose, but you can also take something a little bit more abstract, but no less important, something like, say, the age of first reproduction. again, thinking about moose, these happen to be Swedish moose, where there's good data for these kinds of questions. Not all moose begin reproducing at the same time in their lives. Some moose, as this graph suggests, begin reproducing at age 3. Others begin reproducing at age 4, and others, again, yet at age 5, again, reproducing for the very first time. For an organism that at maximum can only live to be about age 18 to 20, and very frequently they're dead by age 9 or 10. In Sweden, they're dead much younger because they are hunted so severely. Anyways, for an organism that has that kind of lifespan, that's a fair amount of variation. Okay? And we can ask the same kinds of questions. Why should a moose decide, maybe, to reproduce sooner? Why reproduce for the first time at age 3 rather than at age 5? Answers to that questions might be, well, if you start reproducing sooner, you get more chances at reproduction. You might not live very long, and so to begin reproducing now is better than to maybe never reproduce at all, so just get started sooner. Okay, but there's another possibility. Maybe it's better to reproduce later. Maybe, and now let's think about in particular the cows, the female moose. Maybe it's better to say, well, my success in reproduction, the welfare of my calf, how large the calf will be, and that sort of thing, depends on the physical condition of the mother. And so maybe if I wait a little longer, the mother will be of larger body size, be just a little bit better off, and will therefore have healthier offspring, so maybe it's better to wait. Okay? And again, the question is one of those strategies to reproduce sooner or later, is one better than the other? Or are they just different ways to be, different ways to have a life, and they're both equally as well? One more example, just to kind of keep driving this home. When we think about organisms and all of the traits that they have, they're typically not just some random amalgamation of traits, some willy-nilly composite of tall and long-lived and this color hair and reproducing this way. Some of these traits come together. And this graph illustrates that there is often covariation in life history traits. And what I mean by covariation is basically just this. Here what we have are moose that, across the x-axis, we can see they're moose that are reproducing for the first time at different ages, either age 3 or 4. And then on this axis right here, we see that this is the body size of the moose. And what we basically are able to see is that it's the moose that were bigger moose that tended to reproduce earlier for their first reproduction. And it's these smaller moose that tend to reproduce for the first time a bit later in life. That's the covariation, the fact that, if you like, there's a bit of a trend that kind of goes up and down in this way. And so again, the basic idea is that while we can ask questions about what it should be, we can look at the data. In this particular case, we see it's bigger cows tend to reproduce earlier. And so we can ask this question, maybe the advantage is to reproduce earlier. That's what you should do, but only if you're large enough. And if for whatever reason you couldn't get large enough soon enough, better to wait. Again, this is a question. We don't know the answer immediately by just at least looking at this data. But these last 3 slides that I showed you give you this important sense of what it is that individual life history theory is all about. It's about asking why, in this case we'll be thinking about moose, why are moose the way they are in terms of the phenotypes that they hold? Now, there's another idea associated with life history theory. And this idea suggests that there are basically 4 things that a moose or any individual organism has to do. This applies to plants, animals, fungus, bacteria. Any organism has to do 4 things. It has to grow for a certain period in its life. It has to, at some point in its life, reproduce. It has to repair damage that occurs to its body. And it has to execute metabolism to kind of keep the whole machine running. The whole organism has to kind of stay alive, transferring energy and resources from the environment into action that represents the life of an organism. Everything that an organism does can be categorized into one of those 4 things. Well, the other thing that's important about it is that an organism has only so much energy and time and resources to devote to each of these 4 activities. And if you devote it to one, then it's going to maybe have to be taken away from one of these other activities. Another idea that's important about life history theory is that these 4 basic ideas, repair, growth, reproduction, metabolism, these 4 ideas basically correspond to all of the what is referred to as life history traits. Or if you like, these 4 things are related to any particular phenotype that you can measure on an organism. How long it lives, how large it is, its preferences for different types of food items, its habitat preferences, anything that you could measure about an organism, anything that you could say, this is a property of this organism, they relate to those traits. First of all, can be considered life history traits, and they all can be broken down into one of the, or I should say categorized into one of these 4 basic ideas. Again, repair, growth, reproduction, and metabolism. Everything that I've described up until now suggests that there must be some kind of these trade-offs. I already mentioned this briefly. Trade-offs that if you invest a lot of energy into reproduction, then you maybe won't invest as much energy into maybe repairing damage to your own body or this sort of a thing. Lots of other possible trade-offs, but they would all boil down to these 4 ideas. Now what I want to do a little bit is to shift gears just a little bit. I want to talk about this idea called compensatory growth that has to do with the growth of the body of an organism. I want to focus on this idea because this is where we can start to tie life history theory in general into some real specific things that we've learned about moose on Isle Royale in particular. So there's this kind of convergence between these big picture ideas and stuff that we've learned on Isle Royale. First of all, what is compensatory growth? Compensatory growth, it's a simple idea. It's just this notion that there's this accelerated period of growth following a period of undernutrition due to food shortage. This idea was first appreciated in the early part of the 20th century, mostly looking at livestock, where you realize, well, the body size of livestock is pretty important to the people who are raising the livestock because for them it's their livelihood. And they would realize, oh, well, there's this one period of time where they weren't getting quite enough food for whatever reason. The environment that the livestock were raised in maybe was poor or whatever. And they wanted to know, could they make it up? Could they make it up by feeding more food later on? Because maybe if they can't make it up, no need to give them more food. But if they can, well, then maybe you would. So the idea of compensatory growth has this history in agriculture. Since then, it's become of interest to a wide range of organisms, including plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and not surprisingly, moose as well. It's been an important, interesting thing to study. Here's a question about compensatory growth, a prospect, I should say. And that prospect is that compensatory growth may be an adaptive trait that's associated with managing a trade-off between growth in the body and some of these other functions that I just mentioned that a moose has to perform. Okay? Let's just keep that as a prospect or a question for us that will guide our interest as we think about compensatory growth in Isle Royale moose. Now, compensatory growth has been observed and documented in a large number of ungulate species: bighorn sheep, white-tailed deer, roe deer, alpine, ibex. Those 2 species are species that live in Europe. Bison also have been shown to have compensatory growth. So it seems to be this kind of widespread phenomenon in ungulates. It's been demonstrated with some uncertainties in moose. Even though it can be demonstrated, there are still a number of important questions about compensatory growth. And from here on out, just to emphasize, I'll abbreviate compensatory growth with just these letters CG. And so there are these questions that remain about compensatory growth. I want to list them all now, and then we'll inspect them in a little bit of detail coming up. The first thing is, does compensatory growth involve some kind of a cost to the animal? Does the animal have to pay for it, in other words, in terms of the energy devoted to it or something like this? If so, it would imply that there's some kind of a trade-off that we might want to look for. And so, for example, these costs, we can ask these more detailed questions. Do individuals that exhibit compensatory growth, do they live shorter lives? Do they have to pay for that extra energy of having compensatory growth? Do they have to pay for that by maybe not living as long? Again, it's a question. We'll look into it in a little bit. Are these moose that exhibit compensatory growth, are they more likely to exhibit and experience signs of senescence? We'll talk about what senescence is and what it means in just a little bit, but But and again, this is another cost that they might have to pay in order to have this compensatory growth. And I should back up here. You would ask, well, why would you want to pay a cost? Well, you might want to pay that cost because being adequately large might be important for your fitness. And if you missed a chance to get big enough, maybe during your first year of life, you might want to make up for it in your second year. And it would be worth paying some cost. That's the idea behind all of that. Another question that we want to ask is, do males and females differ in their capacity for compensatory growth? We'll talk, it's been a question that's been around for a little while, especially for ungulates. We'll talk about why that might be an important question starting right now. Here's the basic idea. And there's a couple of ideas. Some of the ideas are more than what I've listed on the slide here. And actually, the first idea that I want to share is not on the slide. So let me speak of it this way. The first idea is that I think many of you know that bulls tend to be bigger than cows. They tend to grow larger. They tend to grow quicker. And so one idea is that male moose are always growing as fast as they possibly can so they can get bigger. And because they're always growing as fast as they can't ever exhibit compensatory growth because they're already kind of maxed out as much as they possibly ever can be. But females, they don't grow as big as males, and the reason is because basically it's this, is that the quality of their body, not just how big their body is, ends up being pretty important. It's not just to be big for the sake of being big, but because of the nature of reproduction for a female, they have to raise this calf. Just being big as possible just isn't the biggest deal. They need to be big enough, but not as big as possible. Well, because they just need to be big enough, what this suggests to some researchers is that females are not always growing at their maximum possible rate. They're kind of always balancing between growing big and just kind of being in good shape otherwise, which means they have a little room to work with. If they got shorted in their first year of life for being big, they can maybe ramp it up a little bit in the second year if it's worthwhile. So for this reason, it has been thought that females may have a greater capacity for compensatory growth than do males. These ideas here, if you would allow me, these ideas right here, I want to just let them sit and we'll come back to them in a minute. I should have made my slides a little bit better here. So those second and third question, let's just leave that sit for just a moment. But let's keep in mind these different strategies about bulls and cows, why and how they want to get big or maybe not as much. This represents a real general phenomenon known as sexual dimorphism, and sexual dimorphism is related to sexual selection. And the basic idea is that for very many species, most mammals, in fact, or a large portion of mammals anyways, the males and females are not exactly the same. They have some kind of differences. It may be as simple as the body size is different. It may be that the territories of males tend to be bigger than the territories of females. Sometimes the diets are different. Sometimes just the basic anatomy is different in the sense of, like, for moose, for example, the obvious and striking difference is that the males have antlers and the females don't. So these are all differences between males and females. Those differences are known as sexual dimorphism. And the question is, well, why does sexual dimorphism arise? The person who first answered this question is Charles Darwin, actually. Charles Darwin had 3 great contributions to the field of evolutionary ecology. His first great contribution is to talk about natural selection. His second great contribution is this business about sexual selection. And basically what he said is that the lives that males and females lead are so different. The environments that they live in, the salient part of the environment for a male is different enough from the salient part of the environment for a female that the selection pressures are different. Because the selection pressures are different, they will evolve to be different kinds of creatures. Well, what were these different environmental conditions? Aren't male moose and female moose living in the same place? Yes, more or less. But here's the main difference, is that a big part of the environment you live in is who are you competing with? And here's the thing, is that male moose end up competing with other male moose for access to female mates. And in that competition among males, the environment of a male is different than a female. Females basically don't so much, or at least don't so intensively compete with other females to get access to mates. They need some good resources in order to have a good body so they can raise good offspring, but that's about it. So anyways, those differences give rise to sexual selection, which gives rise to sexual dimorphism, which gives rise to the question we have right now, which is, do females have a greater capacity for compensatory growth than do males? So that's our question, and that's what motivates our question. Okay, and this is the slide that I should have shown you a few moments ago, but I'll leave it here just for a moment. So it's this business that because males grow larger and faster than females, well, this slide, again, sorry, it's put together a bit hastily. Basically, this should say they can't trade off any energy into compensatory growth because they're kind of maxing out as much as they can. So anyways, so this is the question. And now we have to ask this question, the following question is, how will we test this hypothesis? Compensatory growth is a pretty difficult thing to measure. In principle, what you would measure is you'd have this one organism, you'd know what its growth rate is under normal conditions, and then you would see what its growth rate is under stressed conditions of being undernourished, and then see what the subsequent growth can be after those stressed conditions were when they're getting all their food. That's really hard to do. And so we have to be clever in order to test this hypothesis. And I want to take several steps back now. And first of all, just point out that we're going to assess compensatory growth by looking at necropsies, by some of the information that we get from all these necropsies that we do. I mentioned a number of lectures ago that necropsies were a pretty important part of all of the work that we do. During the winter field season and then the summer field season, we spend a lot of time looking for where it is that wolves have killed moose. And then when we find that the wolves are done feeding on those moose and when the wolves have left, then we go and perform these necropsies on them. So I want to just describe a little bit about all of that. I'll describe some of the technical details of these necropsies in a moment, but first I want to describe a little bit about what it's like to do a necropsy. And we do these necropsies, as I mentioned, winter and summer. In the wintertime, basically what happens is that we would have discovered the location of a kill, and we'll put a dot on the map. And then what we do is, to get there, we can't land the plane right next to the kill. It's usually in the middle of the woods. So we land the plane on this nearest frozen lake, we strap on our snowshoes, and we hike in. The first business is just finding it. And it can take 2 or 3 or 4 hours to kind of hike in and find this. And 2 or 3 hours is a big chunk of the day because this is northern latitudes that we're doing this work in, up around 48 degrees north. It's wintertime. That means the days are short. So 3 or 4 hours into a kill site, 3 or 4 hours back to a kill site, that's much of a day. You kind of got to be always paying attention to, do I have enough time to get back to my pickup site before it gets dark, because the plane doesn't really fly in darkness. So you got to, unless you're planning to spend the night in the wilderness in the wintertime, you got to be back at your pickup site by nightfall. So as you're hiking in, you're always mindful of, do I have enough time, and this sort of thing. And you're looking for something, you don't know quite where it's at. You have a dot on the map, and you hope you put the dot on the map really well. And a dot on the map isn't the same as just kind of wandering through a boreal forest where there's just spruce tree after spruce tree. And eventually what happens when you get closer and closer to the kill is you get clues that you're getting closer, and pretty soon you start following those clues. The first thing that happens is you start to see wolf tracks. And you see the wolf tracks originally from the airplane. These wolf tracks are leading to and from this kill site. And these may be wolf tracks that were laid down over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 days. And basically this kill site has just become a magnet for these wolves. And they're coming and going, and so it's like spokes to a wheel, sort of. And you'll have made a mental note from the airplane of where these wolf tracks are coming and going. And so when you're on the ground and you find these wolf tracks for the very first time, the first thing you do is you look at them and see, are these tracks going away from the kill site, or are they going towards the kill site? You look at the direction of what the toenails are doing. Are they going forward in the way that you're going, or the opposite direction? And you try to match that up with what you remember from having seen from the plane. And you just think, I think I know which set of tracks I'm on. And then you got to figure out, well, wolves can walk in different places that I can walk in. Is it to my advantage to follow these tracks? They'll take me straight to the kill. But is it going to be a long, circuitous path, or wolves can crawl through some, what they can walk through, a human would have to crawl underneath and over and around and this sort of a thing. And so, well, anyways, you might follow them for a little while, and sometimes these wolf tracks converge, and that's a good sign. And then pretty soon you'll start to see little blotches of blood in the snow. This may represent where you're actually now on the chase. You're on the tracks where the chase is taking place. And by this time, your mind is really doing a number of things. Your mind is on, okay, got to find the kill site. But you also can't help but realize, wow, I'm walking in a place where just a few days ago, these wolves right here were chasing this moose, and I'm walking amongst the evidence of it right now, the chase tracks and the blood and the snow and that sort of thing. And then as you get closer, the next clue that you sometimes figure out is you can start to hear ravens, because there are usually going to be ravens on this kill site for a long time, even after the wolves have left. But ravens are real shy about people. And of course, you're crunching through the snow in big snowshoes. You're making a lot of noise. And they can always hear you before you can see them. But sometimes, if you're careful and quiet, you can hear them before they hear you, because they're a bit noisy themselves, squawking in the trees, and they're fighting with each other among access to the bits and pieces of food that are scattered on the ground. And so as you're hiking in, what you're doing is you're listening for these ravens, and as soon as you hear the first raven, you just freeze, because you know if you can hear them, they might be able to hear you, and you want to listen real careful to get a clue as to, are they over here in this direction, the ravens, or are they over in this direction, or straight ahead, say, and maybe how far away, because now what happens is you're getting closer and closer. Now these wolf tracks are coming and going from every direction, just crisscrossing. In the wolf tracks, they tell you that, yeah, you're pretty close, but they're not very useful any particular set of tracks. So you're just like, I don't know which tracks to follow to get to the kill site. And the visibility in these forests can be kind of low. To see even just 20 meters away can be tough. So a kill could be 20, 30 meters away, and you won't see it. Because it's maybe in a little low spot or behind some trees or behind a thick patch of vegetation. And so you can literally be wandering around, never very far from the kill site, but hoping to find it. So you listen to these ravens for a clue. And then what happens is again, the intensity of activity picks up. There's more and more tracks. There's more and more blood. You may see even now an entire bone, because maybe a wolf has carried a bone away from the kill site to chew on it in peace and quiet away from its pack mates. You'll start to see scats, wolf scats. You'll see more and more blood. When you get close enough, you will eventually smell it. When you can smell it, the carcass, then you know you're not too far away. But still, sometimes you have to wander around and find it. Well, then eventually you find it. And then the scene is quite variable. Sometimes the scene is like what we see here. And when you walk up onto a scene like this, all kinds of thoughts run across your mind. The first thought that runs across your mind, or one of the first thoughts, is, wow, I wonder if there's any wolves nearby. We don't even go into these sites unless we know that the pack has left. But then there's straggler wolves that don't have radio collars on, so we don't know exactly where they're at, and they could be hiding nearby, and we just don't know it. They're of no bother to us. They're basically afraid of us, but it's still interesting to think about. Wow, I know it happens. There are occasions when there's a wolf just 30, 40 yards away. They've maybe left the carcass just as I approached, and then it makes you want to work kind of quickly just to get out of there and let the wolf back to his own business and that sort of thing. And then, this is the site where really a marvelous and remarkable animal just died. And it's hard to even know all the emotions how to capture them all, but there's just a sense of wanting to kind of honor the animal at this place where he or she had its last stand. And of course, one of the ways that we can honor that animal is by collecting all sorts of information about it. And what happens is this animal is going to tell a story that will long outlive its life. This animal will become more interesting to more people after it died than while it died, mainly just because we can learn so much about it from these necropsies. That's a necropsy in the wintertime. Necropsies in the summertime are a different deal. Many of the cases where we find the carcass or the remains of a moose in the summertime, is stumbles upon by accident. We don't even know that we're looking for such a place. We intentionally and deliberately kind of wander through the forest, just kind of going on long hikes, hoping to get lucky. Turns out about once every 10 miles of hiking, we get lucky, and we stumble upon, usually now it's just bones. And some of these bones have been out there for a long time. You can see in this picture here, there's moss and algae growing on the bones themselves. Something like this, and you can even see in the front of this picture, the nose of the moose has kind of worn away, decomposed right away. And, well, a moose like this may have been in the field for 5, 10, 15 years, and there it is, we've just discovered it. There's not as much to find at these sites, and you may have to even dig through the debris a little bit, the leaves and litter and stuff like that to find the bones. In the background, we can see a few bones here. There's a rib here, another rib here. There's some vertebrae right here. Sometimes you have to literally kind of dig through the soil in order to find the bones that it is that you're looking for. These moose are really just an enigma and a mystery, because we're like, we don't know when it died, and if we don't find all the parts, we won't even know how old it was when it died. And so these sites are kind of fun and interesting because they're just full of this sense of mystery. Well, anyways, when we conduct a necropsy, after appreciating all this, the kind of beauty of the whole thing, really, we have to get down to the business of collecting data, doing some work. And again, we literally collect dozens of pieces of information about the site, but to go through some of the important things. We identify the sex. This can easily be done by just the skull. If it has pedicels or the base for an antler, then it was a male. If there's no spot for the antlers, then it's a female. We also assess whether arthritis was present or not in the moose. We do this by examining the hip bones. And again, here is a hip socket that is normal. And here's a hip socket that has very, very severe arthritis. I'll talk more about arthritis in a little bit. If it's arthritic, we collect that arthritic bone. And if it's a normal pelvis, no arthritis, we just leave it behind. No need to collect it. We also record on these moose whether they have jaw necrosis or not. And I'm pointing out all of these things, all these bits of information that we collect, because they all are going to be very relevant for this question about compensatory growth. I'm not telling you anything that's extra here. All this information is going to be important for compensatory growth. So we also write down, record whether the moose had a normal, healthy jaws, or whether they had shown some signs of jaw necrosis. Both of these situations, jaw necrosis and arthritis, these are things that happen to moose sometimes when the moose gets older. Not always, but often. They are considered very important indicators of senescence. Senescence is something we'll continue to talk about, but senescence is basically just when some part of your body starts to fall apart as you get old. Arthritis and troubles with your teeth are kind of two important examples. We also collect the skull. We collect the skull for a variety of reasons. One of the most important reasons is that when ecologists or people who are studying life history theory want to take measurements, they often take measurements on the skull. It's just a real critical part of an organism to have collected if you're interested in this kind of work, so we collect it. We also collect a metatarsus. Metatarsus is a foot bone. This is a picture of what that bone looks like. You can see a human hand in there, so you can get a sense of roughly how big this bone is. This is pointing to the bone, where that bone is located on a moose. Many people think that moose and other organisms like moose, this includes dogs and cows and deer and stuff like this, they think that they have backward pointing knees. Well, that's a poor interpretation. And if they had backward pointing knees, we would think, oh, that's kind of weird and unusual. Well, the truth is far more bizarre. Moose do not have backward pointing knees, but instead, this is the foot of a moose, and this is the ankle of the moose. And so the joint is pointed in the right direction. The ankle is pointed in the same direction as ours. The really weird part about a moose is that they have these really, really long feet, and they walk on the tips of their toes. And so, imagine the part of your foot that's only, maybe about this long, the bones I'm speaking about now, the bones, all the bones in your feet may be just about this long. Imagine now making your foot like this long. And now imagine just walking on your tiptoes. That's what a moose is doing. Anyways, we collect this bone for a number of different reasons. I'll tell you why in a little bit. It'll figure importantly into some of this business about compensatory growth. We are also interested to estimate the age of the moose and the year of birth. We do this with two bits of information. Well, the estimating the age basically comes from this. First of all, we collect the incisors of the moose, the front teeth of the moose. We collect those. And the reason that we collect those teeth is because if you cut the tooth, I should say actually kind of file or grind away with a grinder that lower part of the tooth so that we can expose this area right here, what happens is that there are layers that are laid every year. Those layers are like tree rings in a tree. They are important for aging a moose. And so if we just zoom in on this area right here, that's what we're looking at right in here. And let me do something here. What we can see, these are the lines right here. And these lines tell us, if we count them very carefully, that this particular moose was 8 years old. So anyways, if we know how old the moose was when it died, that's useful for some of its own bits of information. But also, if we know the year in which the moose died, and if we know how old it was when it died, then we can just do the subtraction and figure out the year in which it was born. And for some analyses that we do, that's important to know the year of birth. So these necropsies have been done for 50 years now, been done thousands of times. And we've got a warehouse full of skulls and metatarsal bones, mandibles, these jaw bones. We have little file drawers full of incisors, all from these different moose. And it's basically with this information that we can test this question and some of our other questions about compensatory growth. So the data that we're going to use are going to be all about these bones. But we still need a little bit more cleverness than just measuring bones. First of all, just imagine that we were to take measurements, metatarsal length, and then let's say the volume of the skull. We can measure the volume of the skull by taking some linear measurements, how long the skull is and how wide it is and how tall it is. Not the entire skull so much, but actually the cranium, where the brain cavity is for this moose. And so you could take any particular moose and say, okay, what was its metatarsal length and what was its skull volume, and you could plot it on a graph. And so each dot would represent a different moose. Okay, well, if you did that for many, many moose, you would expect in general, well, moose that had bigger skulls, they'd probably have longer metatarsal bones. If you're bigger in one way, you'll probably be bigger in another way. Okay, that's fine. That's okay. But we can do a little bit more with that. Here's what we can do a little bit more with. The skull grows throughout the first 4 to 5 years of life for a moose. But the metatarsal bone only grows for about the first year of life, and then it stops. And so here's the deal. We can use that differential period of growth to help us learn about compensatory growth, because if a moose exhibited very little compensatory growth, I should say it a different way. Compensatory growth is something that's extremely difficult to gauge in an individual moose. You have them, especially from just a skeleton. We have one moose. Here it is. I can measure anything I want on it. Can I tell whether that moose, that individual moose, did it exhibit a great deal of compensatory growth or not? That's a tough thing to judge. But you can take a group of moose of all the same kind, like say males, and ask, is this group of moose, as a group, did they tend to exhibit compensatory growth more or less than some other group of moose, say a moose of the opposite sex? Here's how we would do that, is that if a group of moose exhibits little compensatory growth, then we would expect the correlation between metatarsal length and skull volume to be really high, a very high correlation. In other words, metatarsal length would be a very good predictor of skull volume, because the reason for thinking this is that if there's no compensatory growth, then basically body size all around is pretty much pre-programmed. It just kind of gets rolling, and whatever your growth was like in your first year, as indicated by that metatarsal length, is going to kind of be what growth is going to be like for the next several years, as would be indicated by the size of the skull. However, if there's compensatory growth exhibited much more in a different group of moose, then we'd expect a relatively low correlation between metatarsal length and skull volume. And the reason basically would be this, is that growth during your first year, in other words, growth of the metatarsal length, may or may not have a good reflection on what growth will be like during a subsequent year. And because it may or may not have a good relationship to subsequent growth, that will kind of loosen the correlation. That'll tend to make the correlation between those two measurements a little bit lower for this group of moose that tends to, on average, have more compensatory growth. So what we can do is we can basically make these graphs and then just compare whether there is a high correlation or a low correlation between those groups of moose. And so just to kind of recap, we saw this from a previous lecture, R squared is a statistic that we can use to kind of assess how well correlated two things are. R squared, just to recap, goes from 0 to 1. 1 represents this perfect correlation. 0 represents, basically no correlation at all. And so it's this statistic of R squared that we can compare between two groups of moose to kind of answer our question. And so, to return to our question, do female moose have a greater capacity for compensatory growth than do the males? We now know why the question is interesting, important. Compensatory growth is just this basic nature of what a moose is like, and its interest and ambition to grow old. Can it kind of make up for tough years in a subsequent year or not? So it's an interesting question in just that basic sort of way in terms of what the life of a moose is all about. It's an interesting question because it fits into this broader framework of life history theory. If we can understand this for moose, it'll help us understand life history theory in other organisms as well, give us context for understanding life history in other organisms. We talked about the kind of data that we can use, all these bone measurements, and we talked about the statistics that we can use. Now we're all set to basically answer the question, and it goes basically like this. Our hypothesis is this. We will conclude that females have a greater capacity for compensatory growth than males if this is true. If the R squared for the females is less than the R squared for the males with respect to these relationships that are shown in the graph here. And so we're just looking to compare this possibility to this possibility for the males and the females. That's what we're looking for, and this is what we find. First of all, the correlations are really quite low, all around quite low. This suggests in general that there's a lot of compensatory growth going on for both males and females. There's a great deal of truth to the bit that knowing how much you grew in your first year has pretty little to do with how much you're going to grow in a subsequent year. Okay, so that tells us that there's quite a bit of compensatory growth going on all around. The next thing we learn is that the R squared for the females is greater than the R squared for the males. It's an unexpected result. It's not in the direction that we had expected, where we had expected the females to be less. We can go a little bit further. It turns out that if you are being very statistically minded, we can conduct a hypothesis test to ask if there is a statistically significant difference between 12% and 6%. Those are different numbers, of course, but are they different enough to make a difference? And if we perform such a hypothesis test, we find out that the p-value is relatively large. It turns out there's not a significant difference between those two numbers. In either event, the hypothesis that we had, the notion that females have this greater capacity for compensatory growth, it seems to not be well supported by the data. Okay, well, why is this? A few slides ago, I kind of fumbled through those slides and didn't explain things very clearly and carefully. Here's my chance to kind of clean that up and clarify. The reason we were interested in this hypothesis in the first place is because other scientists had proposed the ideas that we're looking at right here. The idea that because males grow as fast as they can, always, they don't have and that's a misprint. They can't, is what it should say. They can't trade off any energy into growing any faster. They're always growing as fast as they possibly can. As a result, females have this flexibility. They can decide to put a little more or a little less into growing big, and so that's why they should have that. I think that the fact that the Isle Royale data, which is one of the best tests, I think, of these differences between males and females, I think the Isle Royale data suggests that basically life is just a little bit more complicated than what people have been supposing before. And I think here's the thing, is that growing big might still be important for females, just for different reasons. For a male, they want to grow big so that they can compete with other males. Okay, and so they also, as a result, end up growing larger. But still, being big for females is important. It's just that they got other things to do as well, and they may want to grow as big as they are able to all of the time in order to basically have more, better quality offspring. And the other thing is that males are not just about growing physically large. They also have this business of growing antlers. And some males are maybe a little bit smaller in their mass in terms of overall number of kilograms, but their antlers are pretty big. Well, energy they put into growing those antlers is energy they may not be able to put into growing big physically. And so, in other words, males may have more trade-off capability than we've given them credit for, and females maybe don't have quite as much trade-off capability as we've given them credit for. In other words, this whole business about sexual selection might be just a little bit more complicated than we've been kind of treating before, and that may be the reason that we don't see a difference between males and females in terms of compensatory growth. Okay? So we wanted to check out a couple of hypotheses about compensatory growth. One of them was about differences between the sexes. The second hypothesis that we wanted to talk about is about whether moose that died with signs of senescence, are they a group of moose that tended to have exhibited more compensatory growth during their life than other moose? That is, moose that died without showing signs of senescence. The signs of senescence that we're speaking about in particular is this arthritis and the jaw necrosis. And the basic idea is getting at whether compensatory growth is a real costly thing or not. The basic idea is that if compensatory growth is costly, it might involve some kind of a trade-off later in life, and that trade-off might be an increased chance of getting arthritis or jaw necrosis. Basically, what's going on here is this. Remember a little while ago I showed you that big pie chart that said that animals have to do 4 things. One thing they have to do is grow. Another one of the 4 things they have to do is maintain their bodies. I refer to it as repair. Basically, you could, if you wanted to, invest a lot of energy into repairing your body. If you spent a lot of energy in repairing your body, you wouldn't get arthritis. You wouldn't get jaw necrosis. You put all your energy into making those traits basically impervious to those troubles. There's no law of physics that prevents that from being possible. Your teeth and your hips could be maybe made better than they are now, and just through more energy they'd last longer, or I should say, unless you spent that energy doing something else, like trying to do catch-up growth, like trying to have compensatory growth. That's what we're interested in. If this possibility is true, then the hypothesis is basically this. It's that the R squared of senescent moose would be less than the R squared of non-senescent moose. Again, other ways of saying the same thing is that these senescent moose, these moose that died with these troubles, they maybe had more compensatory growth a little bit earlier in life. And so what we see on the left-hand side is a graphical expectation of what might happen if this hypothesis is true. Here's what we find. What we find is that the R squared for senescent moose is 0.18. The R squared for the non-senescent moose is 0.29. That pattern is just the same as what we had hypothesized. And so in just this general sense, it's what we expected, except when we do that hypothesis test, when we ask this question, okay, sure enough, 0.29 is a bigger number than 0.18. But is the difference big enough to be important? And when we do that hypothesis test, then the p-value is fairly large. The p-value is 0.16. That p-value is too big, and we have to conclude that these two numbers, 0.18 and 0.29, they differ but not enough to be important, and therefore we conclude, well, you know, these two different groups of moose, they don't differ in their capacity for compensatory growth. It's not expected. The result is not expected. Okay. Let's just ask the same general question, but in a different way. Maybe compensatory growth is costly, but it's costly in a different way. Maybe the cost is not manifest as showing signs of senescence later in life. Maybe the cost is shown as you just don't plain live as long. And so here's the question. Did moose that lived shorter lives, do they exist a greater capacity for compensatory growth than did longer-lived moose? You know, this question is in some ways, it's pretty abstract. The concept is pretty abstract. The data that we're using to assess it is pretty abstract. And in that way, it can be kind of tough to wrap your mind around. But this question, of the three questions that we're looking at, differences between sex, differences between whether you have senescence or not, and this question here, this one I think is the most interesting. Think about, especially the top question right up in here. We're talking about two really basic features of any organism's life, whether it be a moose or an insect or a plant or your own life. Two basic features are: how big are you? Are you a big person or a small person? And how long are you going to live? And what we're looking for is, are there some trade-offs between these two things? It's a really, really interesting question if we think about it in these terms. And so what I want to remind you is, in all of the technical detail, which is necessary, don't lose sight of what a basic and important question this really is. Okay, so to test this hypothesis, basically what's going on, what we have to basically figure out or assess, is whether the R squared for short-lived moose is greater than the R squared for long-lived moose. We want to check it out this way because we think it's the short-lived moose. Ooh, wait one moment. Yes, I've got this right. Whether the short-lived moose basically, wait a moment here. I've got some signs mixed up here. I think we'll clean it up in just a minute here. I think I have my sign wrong, and I think I have my graphs mixed up here. So let's not focus too much on the graph. We'll just talk our way through it, and we'll be fine. And it's going to go this way. Sorry for the confusion once again. If you're a short-lived moose, what we're saying is that you must be short-lived because you must have paid some price. Well, what price might you have paid? You might have paid the price of having that compensatory growth earlier in life. If that's true, if you had compensatory growth, then you'd have a lower R squared. So this sign is reversed, and then the sign is reversed, but the pictures that I have are just correct. Sorry about that once again. And so here's the data. So we still want that red annotation that I made is still correct, the less than sign. And here's what we find, okay, is that the R squared for these short-lived moose is 0.29, and the R squared for these long-lived moose is 0.14. This is opposite of what we expect. Relatively speaking, these short-lived moose had a high R squared. They are not exhibiting quite so much compensatory growth as the long-lived moose. The long-lived moose with the low R squared value appear to have had more compensatory growth. This is quite unexpected. Okay, this one deserves some explanation because not only is it unexpected, but now when we ask whether these two numbers, again, whether this 0.14 and 0.29, they're different, but are they different enough? Are they statistically significantly different? Then when we perform that test, what we find down here at the bottom, that p-value is very small. That's a very significant difference. There's something important going on here, and it's exactly opposite of what we expected, and it deserves an explanation. And the explanation is basically this. Okay, the conclusion is that it's the long-lived moose that had greater compensatory growth. Okay, well, how, the question is, where's the life history trade-off? Where's the cost that had to be paid? there's a really good explanation for what might be going on here, and that explanation is something that's a relatively new idea to life history theory, something that's only been kind of being appreciated in the last several years. In order to understand this idea, what we have to do is take a step back, look at some other examples of life history trade-offs, and see about what's going on. Here's a very good example about red squirrels. In red squirrels, what we see is this situation. Let's just explain the graph first. What we have along the x-axis here are basically two different kinds of squirrels. Squirrels that choose to delay their timing of first reproduction. They reproduce a little bit later in life, in their in their third or fourth year of life. And then over here, we have squirrels that are reproducing as early as they possibly can, basically in their second summer of life, when they're just a little bit over 1 year old. Okay? And then what we see on this situation right here is that the ones that delay reproduction, you'd say, well, delaying reproduction, that's maybe not so good because you'll have fewer chances to reproduce, especially if you're a red squirrel. You don't live that long. But if you delay your reproduction a little bit, those squirrels, it turns out, they live a little longer. Maybe because they delayed their reproduction. And then these squirrels that reproduced early, the ones that, hey, we're not waiting, we're going to get right to it, they seem to be paying a price. Well, the price they pay is they don't live quite as long. This represents a life history trade-off. And in this particular case, the trade-off is indicated by that declining line. Trade-offs are not always indicated by a declining line, but in this case it is. You get one good thing, but the other consequence is something bad is going to kind of happen. Again, it's a trade-off in some really basic things, the whole nature of your reproduction and how long you're going to live. For many decades, life history theory was more or less devoted to just finding these trade-offs in all kinds of traits. All different kinds of traits, looking for, oh, okay, it's good in this way, but bad in that way, and here's how these organisms are kind of making these trade-offs. Royale is showing something a little bit different, and what we're showing is, in here we can kind of look at it in different ways here. Along the x-axis is compensatory growth, where it's basically over here on the left is less growth, less compensatory growth, over here is more growth, and what happens is that there's no trade-off, because here we would say that's the good thing. To have more compensatory growth is the good thing. Over here on the vertical y-axis, well, the good thing is to have a longer life. Okay, well, what we find is these moose, they have both good things, the greater compensatory growth and the longer lifespan, or they have both of the lousy things. They're unable to have compensatory growth and they don't live as long. There's no trade-off. They have both of these good things, or they have neither of these good things. Well, basically what's happening here is that this graph suggests, and this is a pretty important point, this graph suggests that, well, of these different squirrels, they're just two different ways to live a good life. You can kind of get revved up, have a lot of reproduction real quick, and you won't live quite as long, but you maybe at the end you'll just be just fine, produce as many offspring over your lifespan as another squirrel who takes a little bit slower approach to life. Doesn't reproduce quite as quickly, but they get to live a little longer, and in the end is just a different way to get to the same final answer, which is the same amount of reproduction. It says basically these trade-offs, that there's a lot of different ways to lead a very fit life. This graph doesn't suggest that that's the case at all. This graph suggests something very different. What it suggests is that there are winners and losers. There are some organisms that have all the good traits and other organisms that have none of the good traits. And that basically when we see all this variation in life, it is not simply just different ways to have a good life, different ways to be equally fit. Instead, what it says is that some animals are just better than others. And this is a realization that's only been kind of appreciated in the last couple of years. Here's another really great example of it. It comes from only the year 2006. It's an example in Bighorn Sheep, and I want to show you the example just to show you kind of how it can crop up in different ways. What we have on this x-axis for these Bighorn Sheep are different individuals that were investing either more energy or less energy into reproductive effort, kind of how much behavior they were spending on competing with other males and that kind of business, and how long it is that these animals lived. If there was a life history trade-off, you expect a relationship like this, that the individuals who put less energy into reproduction, that they would live longer. The ones that put more energy into reproduction, they would not live as long. That's what you expect for this trade-off kind of situation, but we see that that's not the case. We see a situation much like on Isle Royale. And so Isle Royale is kind of, these Isle Royale moose are kind of feeding this relatively new idea, which says that life history and all of the variation in the different lives that we see out there, it might not be all about trade-offs. It might instead be about, some organisms are better than others. We're still trying to sort all of this out in the big picture for ungulates in general and for organisms in general. But Isle Royale is kind of figuring in this interesting way. So just to kind of recap a little bit. So we looked at some really particular things. Compensatory growth, kind of an abstract idea, but it relates to many, many different ideas, and we can return to this business about body size, because compensatory growth is, in fact, a lot about body size. And there are these two questions. Does the diversity represent these different ways of being equally fit, or is it represent just unequal fitness among these individuals? There is a third possibility, and the third possibility, and this third possibility is especially useful to be focusing on this graph, is, well, maybe these small individuals, this would be also individuals that maybe never show compensatory growth because sometimes they're just going to plain old be small. Maybe in some environments, in some geographic locations, it's better to be small. And maybe in other geographic locations, it's better to be big. And so really the answer is not simply one or two, but it might be this third possibility that some geographic areas it's better to be big and others it's better to be small, and that explains the diversity that we see. And there's yet another possibility that's related to this third idea. And that third possibility is that maybe during some years, because in particular maybe the weather, it's more appropriate or suitable to be small. And in other years, it's just better off to be big. Maybe it has to do with how much forage is available, or maybe it's got something to do with how many predators are in the environment. And we know that the environment changes over time. And so here's the point, is that variation in the environment over space and or time can explain this variation in any particular trait, in this case, body size. And so life history has all of these complexities. And again, just to kind of wrap up this one idea, we're learning all of these interesting things about what it's like to be a life, what it's like to have different kinds of lives. We learn all these interesting insights really by just collecting a bunch of bones. And to think that year after year, just one necropsy at a time, what could you learn from the length of one metatarsal bone? Well, not much. But when you do it thousands and thousands of times and put that data and connect it with a really interesting question, then the insights can be really just interesting. And then the whole activity becomes interesting. Not only what it is that's being learned, but also how it is that we collect the data and in this sort of a business. So it's fun and interesting in those ways. We're going to stop right now, but we want to pick up one more topic about the life history of moose. We already spoke about compensatory growth, but the next topic that we'll speak about has to do with arthritis. We're going to really focus on that one trait. It's a form of senescence, and it turns out that senescence itself, it has a lot of interesting things to tell us about the nature of life history trade-offs. And so that's what we're going to explore during the next lecture. And well, anyways, until then, thanks so much for all the attention that you've given me for this lecture, and we'll look forward to sharing more during the next lecture. Bye now.